Hello and welcome to our guest speaker Deb Gajic. She is going to explain all you need to know about research methods in psychology. In this episode, Deb is going to explain about correlations. The host asking the questions is Dot Blakemore.
Right. Good morning, Deb. Welcome
Good
back.
morning. Good morning, Dorothy. Lovely to be here again.
So today we're looking at correlations, is that right?
That certainly is, yes.
Okay, so what are correlations?
Well, correlations are a little bit confusing, I think, for students because they're not actually a research method. They're really a statistical procedure to identify relationships between variables. And one of the main things to remember with correlations is we don't have an IV and a DV like we do in an experiment. We don't have an independent and dependent variables because relationships are being looked for. So we have co-variables. So it's really important to make sure you're using the right terminology because the one thing correlations cannot do is they cannot show causation. They can only show that one thing is related to another. So the example I always use is that the colour of the grass is correlated with ice cream sales. So you might notice that the more yellow the grass gets, the more ice creams are sold. Now, of course, it'd be ridiculous to claim that ice cream sales and grass colour are causing each other. One's causing the other. Everyone can quickly identify that there's a third variable that's causal, and that, of course, is temperature or sunshine. When the sun shines, we eat more ice cream. When the sun shines and we don't get much rain, the grass goes more yellow. So we call that the third variable problem. So that's a really important thing to remember about correlations. They're about relationships, not causation.
Great. Okay, so what types of correlations are there?
There are three major types of correlations, really. There are positive correlations where both variables are changing in the same direction. For example, the more hours you spend studying, the better your grades will get. Then there are negative correlations, where as one variable increases, the other decreases. So, for example, the older your car, the more you'll spend on repairs. And the final type is not really a correlation at all. It's when we find no relationship or no variables that correlate. So, for example, there's obviously no relationship between the size of your TV and how much television you actually watch.
So how are correlations displayed?
So, correlations are displayed on scatter graphs or sometimes called scatter diagrams. So, basically, you're putting a box on your graph where the two variables meet. What we then do with those is we have to try and see if there's a pattern, if we can put a line of best fit. Now, it's really important when you're drawing a graph that you make sure it has a title, that your X and your Y axes are properly labeled, and if appropriate, there's a line of best fit. So just to give you an idea, if there was a perfect positive correlation, then your line of best fit would be a perfect 45-degree angle. The types of exam questions you might get about this is you might well be asked to draw a scatter graph of a correlation. You'd be given the raw data and asked to draw the graph. Typically, they're worth about 4 marks, but obviously they're looking for titles and axes labels as well as an accurate diagram. The other type of question you might be asked is you might be given a graph and asked to interpret it. So what do you see? What's the pattern? What sort of correlation is being shown on this graph?
Okay, so good advice there. So what's a correlation coefficient?
The coefficient is the number you get once you've done your number crunching, once you've done your statistical analysis. Now, typically, we'd use either Spearman's or Pearson's, depending on whether our data's ordinal or interval. But don't worry too much about that. What you need to be able to understand is what the numbers mean, less about how you calculate them. So when we do our calculation, we always get a number between -1 and +1. The closer it is to 1, the stronger the relationship. So, for example, plus 0.9 would be a very strong positive correlation. Minus 0.9 would be a very strong negative correlation. And the closer that number is to 0, the more it tells us that there is no relationship at all. We can also see this or estimate it on a graph on how close that line of best fit is to 45 degrees. If it was a perfect 45 degrees, it would be a +1 or a -1. So that's what we're looking for.
Okay, so, excuse me, what are the strengths of correlations?
Correlations measure the strength of a relationship. So we can see whether something's very closely related or if there's just a slight relationship. It gives us a numerical figure. So we can say there's a strong relationship between X and Y, or there's an average relationship, or there's no relationship. So there is a further strength. The other strength is that correlations are usually the first step in research. As we said, they're actually a statistical procedure and they can't show cause. So what researchers tend to do is do a correlation and then devise maybe an experiment or some other sort of research to try and find the basis of that relationship.
Okay, do they have any limitations?
Oh, it certainly does. And the major limitation is it cannot show cause. It's only showing us a relationship. The other problem is correlations cannot measure what we call curvilinear relationships. Now, curvilinear relationships, and you might be familiar with this if you study sports psychology or from psychopathology or stress, the idea that if you think about stress, the Dodson law, the inverted U, that stress can improve our performance up to a point, but then if we get too stressed, it goes off the other end. If you try and analyze that sort of a relationship with a correlation, you'll get a complete nonsense answer because they're just not designed to measure those curvilinear relationships where something at first goes up and then comes down.
Thanks very much, Deb, for your insights on correlations in psychology. Very useful. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Deb Gajic, for your insights on correlations in psychology.